The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this presentation is to notify you and to get some input on possible changes that the Council is considering for the management of Red Porgy in the South Atlantic. So this is Amendment 50 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, and it's a public scoping presentation. My name is Myra Brower. I am Council staff, and I will walk you through the potential actions in this amendment and give you a little bit of an overview for Red Porgy. So starting off with this graphic that I'm sure some of you have already seen, this shows you basically opportunities for public input during development of an FMP amendment. So we are at the scoping stage for this amendment. This is where the council is looking to get input from the public. They're thinking about taking a management action, and they want to get additional information from stakeholders. In this particular case, though, Red Porgy has recently undergone a stock assessment, so the council has to take action to change the catch levels in response to that stock assessment. So what I'm going to do in this video is give you some background and talk about the management history and the status of the Red Porgy stock in the South Atlantic. We're going to take a quick overview of the commercial fishery in recent years, what the recreational fishery has been doing in recent years, and walk you through proposed actions in the amendment, and then finally how to provide your comments to the council. So first off, a little background. This timeline shows you the management and changes in the status of the stock over time, beginning in the early 90s when Amendment 4 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan declared the stock was overfished and undergoing overfishing. So that amendment put in place the first 10-year rebuilding plan and a minimum size limit for Red Porgy. About 8 years later, there was an emergency rule that the National Marine Fisheries Service published to prohibit harvest and possession in federal waters. And that was to give the council time to develop Amendment 12, which was implemented in 2000. And that one closed commercial harvest during the peak spawning season at the beginning of the year and reduced trip and bag limits and specified the 18-year rebuilding plan that's been in place and ended in December of 2017. And then there's been two updates to the assessment of Red Porgy in 2006 and in 2012. And both of those updates indicated the stock was undergoing overfishing. And most recently, a stock assessment was completed last year. It's called CDAR 60. And that assessment indicated the stock was not only undergoing overfishing, but was also overfished and was not making adequate progress towards rebuilding. So here's where things are for Red Porgy. I'll just walk you through some figures here. This first one is the spawning stock biomass relative to the level below which the stock is considered to be overfished. And that level, that horizontal line you see there is the minimum stock size threshold. So that's the ratio of that biomass there. And you can see that Red Porgy are below that line, and that indicates the stock is not in good shape. Again, spawning stock biomass, this time measured relative to that spawning stock biomass that's needed to produce maximum sustainable yield for the fishery. And again, we see that Red Porgy spawning stock biomass is below that threshold there. And then finally, this one shows you what fishing mortality has been doing. This is the current fishing mortality relative to that rate that would result in maximum sustainable yield. And you can see that fishing mortality is a good bit above that indicator line there. So these are graphs that were extracted from that CDAR 60 assessment that I just mentioned was completed last year. So why is the council taking action? So Red Porgy is overfished, And so that means that a rebuilding plan has to be put in place to make sure there's enough biomass to bring the population back to a sustainable level. So the council has 2 years from when they're notified that the stock is overfished to put in that rebuilding plan. And they received that notification from the National Marine Fisheries Service in June of this past year. So they have until June of 2022 to get a rebuilding plan in place. The stock is also experiencing overfishing, which means the council needs to take immediate action to end overfishing, and they do that by adjusting regulations to control the rate of harvest, so the fishing mortality. The other thing that's happened is the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP, was modified in recent years to improve the approach that's used to estimate recreational landings. Those revised estimates were included in the new assessment for Red Porgy. So what that means is the managers need to adjust catch levels and sector allocations. So the assessment and the resulting management are kind of in the same currency, so to speak. And this is something that's going to be affecting fisheries the council manages that have a recreational component. And so that's another reason the council has to take action, is to adjust those catch levels and allocations to account for that revision to the recreational landings estimates. So let's look at what's in place for the commercial sector. There's a 14-inch minimum size limit for Red Porgy in place. There's also a 60 fish trip limit January through April and 120 fish May through December. The commercial annual catch limit is allocated currently 30% to January through April and 70% May through December. And these changes actually went into effect, these last two bullets that you see on your screen, in February of 2020. The split season and the removal of that sale prohibition that used to be in place in January through April were intended to minimize discarding of Red Porgy. So those are fairly recent changes. Here's a summary of the commercial landings and pounds whole weight by year. Commercial harvest has averaged about 78% of the annual catch limit over this time frame. This shows you the percent of trips that are harvesting Red Porgy in the commercial sector. And so you can see on the bottom, it's split into bins or categories. And this graph is based on about 5,600 trips that harvested Red Porgy, and it's in numbers of fish. And it looks at data from 2015 through 2019. So you can see that most of the trips over these past 5 years have harvested less than 30 fish per trip. This shows you the predicted monthly landings, so you can see the seasonality of the fishery, and this is based on data for the past 3 years, 2017 through 2019, and this is with the current trip limits. So the values for January through April, the bars that are in blue, are projected values since the landings were not allowed. I guess the fishery was closed for up until recently, and so we had to go back and sort of fill in those landings for those years. But it shows you how the landings are distributed on an annual basis on average. And then for the recreational side, just a quick snapshot here, reminder of the regulations that are in place. We have a 3 fish per person per day bag limit, or 3 per trip, whichever is more restrictive, and also a 14-inch total length minimum size limit for the recreational sector. The landings are shown on the screen on the right-hand side in pounds whole weight, and this is information that's based on the revised recreational estimates. So these numbers incorporate that change in methodology that I spoke about earlier, and that's called a fishing effort survey. So you'll hear people talk about the FES data. So that's what they're talking about. It's the revision that recently happened to recreational estimates. This shows you Red Porgy landings per trip. So you have categories 1 to 2 fish, 3 to 4 fish, and it's broken down by mode. So you've got charter in the blue bars, private recreational in orange, and headboat in the gray. This graph shows you data from 2015 through 2019. So you can see that most trips are harvesting less than that 3 bag limit Red Porgy regulation. And here is the catch distribution by mode. So broken down by the 3 sectors, the 3 components of the recreational sector. You've got headboat in the gray, charter in the blue, and private recreational in the orange. And looking at landings broken down by wave. So landings for the recreational sector are collected in these 2-month increments that are called waves. And this graph here shows you data from 2015 through 2017 and then 2019. We excluded landings from 2018 because they were highly imprecise. And so the predicted landings, which is the line, the dashed red line, were determined from taking an average of the landings from those years that I just told you about. And now let's go over the catch level recommendations and the proposed actions in this amendment. So this table shows you what the Scientific and Statistical Committee has recommended to the Council. The SSC is the advisory body that makes recommendations to the Council based on the best available science. So they brought these to the Council in June of this past year. At the top of the table is the OFL, the overfishing limit. So this is a threshold level, if you will. So if overall catch goes above these levels, then the stock would be undergoing overfishing in that year. Down below is the acceptable biological catch, and that's the maximum amount that of a stock that can be harvested in a given year without having negative impacts on the population, or the amount that can be taken out of the population in a given year, I should say. And the Council can't exceed the ABC that's recommended by their SSC. They can set the ACL at the same level, but they cannot go above it. So right now, the recommendation for 2022 is for 75,000 pounds whole weight. So you can see the numbers after that for 2023 to 2026 go up. And this is presumably because the stock biomass is going to go up after a rebuilding plan is put in place, which is one of the things this amendment is going to be doing, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. So what does this mean? This means that significant reductions are needed for Red Porgy that based on these recommended catch levels. So the total ACL right now is 328,000 pounds whole weight. And we have to change it to go down to the highest possible new ACL based on the stock assessment and the SSC's recommendations of 75,000 pounds. However, keep in mind that these catch levels are not directly comparable. And that's because of the issue that I just spoke about, the recreational estimate revision. And so the current ACL includes the old recreational estimates, and the one that's been proposed does not. So these two values are not directly comparable. So keep that in mind. But if we look at the reduction from recent catches, it's some pretty substantial reduction. So it's approximately 68.5% reduction for the commercial sector and an 80% reduction for the recreational sector. So that's what the managers are having to accomplish with changes in management measures. So here's where we get into the actions. The first one is putting in place that rebuilding time frame. If the council does nothing, then rebuilding would not take place, and we can't have that. The rebuilding plan that was in place recently, as I said, ended in 2017. The second option there on your screen is T-min. And that's the minimum time that's allowed to rebuild under the law. So this is under a fishing mortality rate of 0, which means no fishing is allowed. In that scenario, rebuilding would happen in 11 years with a 51% probability of success. And I should say that all these scenarios assume that management starts in 2022. Option 3 is T-min plus 1 generation. 1 generation is the average length of time between when an individual is born and the birth of its offspring. And for red porgy, that's 6 to 7 years, more or less. It's not a point value, so T-min plus 1 would be 18 years. The next option is T-min times 2. So you just take that 11 years times 2, 22 years. And these is to give the council a range of options that they can select from. And the last one is T-max, the maximum time that's allowed to rebuild. And this scenario would keep the fishing mortality rate at 75% of the rate that's expected to result in maximum sustainable yield, and that would put rebuilding in 26 years with a 50% chance of rebuilding success. So that's the range of options there. The next action is adjusting the total annual catch limit and the optimum yield. Right now, that level is 328,000 pounds whole weight. If the council adopted the recommended levels, that's option 2 there on your screen. That would put us at 75,000 pounds whole weight for the total ACL and the optimum yield. They could step it down a little bit to give themselves a buffer there to not bump right up against that acceptable biological catch, and that would bring it down to 67,500 pounds whole weight. Or they could step it down even further under option 4 to 80% of that updated ABC. Again, a reminder, these are all levels for 2022. They would obviously change a little bit moving forward. So this is the stated preference of the council right now. Allocations, there is an action in there to revise them. Again, the council needs to take action to do this. Take a look at how that total ACL is distributed between the commercial and the recreational sector and make changes as they see fit. They could choose to keep things as they are, and that's 50-50 allocation, commercial, recreational. They could apply the allocation formula that they've used for other species, and that one is on the bottom there below the table. And that is calculated using 50% of the average landings from 1986 through 2008, plus 50% of the average landings from 2006 to 2008. So if they apply that formula to the recommended catch levels, then you get this breakdown here, which is very close to the current 50-50 split. And you can see what the corresponding ACLs would be there on the right-hand column. The council could remove allocations if they wanted to, so that's been included in there as an option for them to consider. Action 3 would then adjust those sector ACLs based on whatever allocation they choose. This is showing you if they retain the 50-50 allocation, this is what it would look like. And so if you look at 2022, there's that commercial split season that I told you about, where 30% of the commercial ACL is allocated to the first season, January through April, and 70% of the commercial ACL is allocated to season 2. So those are going to be the catch levels in that scenario, shown here in the red box. The fourth action looks at adjusting the recreational annual catch target. And annual catch targets are levels that can be used to prevent catch from exceeding a sector's annual catch limit. The council has not employed ACTs in management, but they've specified them for the recreational sector. So they have several options. They could retain the current one, but you can see that's a level that's a good bit higher than even the recommended acceptable biological catch. So they're going to have to adjust that one. They can revise it with the new catch levels and the same formula that they've been using, and that would put the ACT at 20,753 pounds whole weight, or they could simply remove it since they've not been actually using these specifications, these targets to affect management. So in terms of possible changes to regulations, to the commercial management and recreational measures, this is where the council needs to spend a little bit more time talking about it, and they're going to be having discussions at their upcoming meeting in March. So this is where they're looking for a lot of public input. So they always have the option of keeping what's in place, and that's at the top there on your screen. So currently 60 fish trip limit in the first season, 120 fish the second season with that commercial split of the ACL. They could choose to reduce the trip limit in season 1, and you can see the range there from 15 to 45 fish per trip is what they've indicated they're interested in considering. They also asked us to prepare analyses for them to consider reductions in season 2, and the range they gave us was 15 through 60 fish per trip. And so they could select to reduce the trip limit just in one season or reduce it in both seasons. And so that's the kind of stuff they're going to be talking about. And here's a preliminary analysis showing the estimated reductions from the projected landings for these potential trip limits. So it's color coded there for you. The season 1 is in blue at the top. And so you can see the range of trip limits in the middle column and the respective predicted percent reduction in the landings for each of those trip limits. And of course, the second season in the brown on the bottom of that table. In terms of changes to recreational management measures, they can retain the existing 3 fish per person bag limit or 3 per trip. They could reduce that down to 1 or 2 fish per person per day or per trip, whichever is more restrictive. They could also look at establishing a recreational season, and they could look at closing various waves for the recreational sector. You've got several options here on the screen. They could also look to establish a vessel limit. And, you know, they could do, as I said, each of these things independently, or they could pick, you know, to do all of these things in order to get to that 80% reduction that's needed for the recreational sector. So here's some preliminary numbers for you to look at. So this is the estimated reductions from projected landings for the bag limit. So similar to what I just showed you for the commercial sector. And it's broken down by mode, and it's indicated overall at the bottom of the table. So it looks like it would be a more significant reduction for the private recreational under, of course, a 1 fish bag limit. And I should say that the total percent change here is weighted by the contribution of each of the landings from each mode to the overall landings of Red Porgy. So this shows you the percent change in Red Porgy landings for each potential trip limit and bag limit combination. So when I say trip limit here, I'm talking about vessel limits. So we're talking just options that we have here to show you for scenarios, 15 fish per vessel or 10 fish per vessel, and then various bag limits underneath. And the green cells, of course, show you a smaller decrease, while the red cells are going to show you a larger decrease in predicted landings. And you've got that overall at the bottom as well. When the council changes recreational management measures, they also can adjust the accountability measures. So these are the measures that are put in place to make sure that landings aren't going to bump up against the ACL or go above it. And these are corrective actions that can be taken if those things happen, or to prevent them from happening. So they're going to be considering modifying accountability measures, and those could include announcing the start and end of a recreational season each year, for example, in-season closures if ACLs are reached, and paybacks if ACLs are exceeded, and depending on the status of the stock. So those are all options that they're going to be discussing moving forward as well. And so that brings us to the timing of the amendment. We're doing scoping hearings right now in February. And the council is going to be reviewing comments from scoping hearings in March and giving us guidance to further develop the amendment through the year with the intent for them to approve it potentially at the end of the year at their December meeting or their March 2022 meeting so that they can meet that regulatory, that statutory deadline of June 2022. And that's when we would expect regulations to be effective. So here's just a few questions to get you thinking about how the kind of input the council would like to hear from you. For the commercial sector, is it more important to have a longer season or a higher trip limit? Which one is going to work out better? And are there any additional management measures that can be considered? And then for the recreational sector, what would be the best time to potentially put in place a recreational season for Red Porgy? And is it more important to keep a certain bag or vessel limit or to have a longer season? And of course, if there's any additional changes you think the council could consider, then they'd like to hear that as well. And how you can provide your comments several ways. We're doing webinars coming up in February on the 3rd at 6 p.m. and on the 4th at 6 p.m. And those webinars are open to the public, of course. They are easy to register for. You can quickly find the links for the webinars by clicking on the upcoming meetings button on the homepage and register for that. And you can also write in comments if you need a little bit more time or you want to speak on the webinar. You can send your comments through the online form that's available on the council's website from the public hearings and scoping meetings page. We ask that you submit your comments by 5 p.m. on the 5th for the council to consider at their upcoming meeting so we can summarize them and package them up for them. One good thing about that tool is, council members can look at that immediately. Those comments are available not just for them to look at, but also for the public. So you can read what other folks are saying as well. You can mail your comments to the address on the screen, and you can also fax them. So lots of different ways to provide your input. And then finally, if you have any questions or you want to chat more about Red Porgy and these upcoming changes, you're more than welcome to call me or send me an email. Again, my name is Myra, and I'd be more than happy to chat with you. And I'll be on the webinars next week, and we can chat then too. Thank you for your attention.